Welcome to the Wednesday Noon Series. This is the last event in this year's Wednesday Noon Series. The series will begin its 18th year on the first Wednesday in October with our traditional opening, a showing of the prior year's award-winning national and international TV commercials. So do join us in October. I'm Sherry Gill, Director of Special Events for the University and your host for this series. I'd like to call your attention to the cards on your chairs, and any support for this series is much appreciated. We like to think we enrich the cultural life here at the university for everyone. Today is so special for us because here to reminisce about Johns Hopkins University, we have with us Robert B. Pond, Professor of Metallurgy, who has been at the university for 41 years. Bob, will you stand up, face everybody? And Francis Spike, as we all know him, Carlson, Professor of Biophysics, who has spent 43 years at Johns Hopkins, including 4 years as an undergraduate. Spike, stand up. And Abel Wolman, Professor Emeritus of Environmental Engineering, who at the age of 96 has spent 55 years of his life, including 4 years of a student at Hopkins. Abel. Together, these three gentlemen, who will speak to us in the order in which I have introduced them, have contributed 139 years of their wonderful energy to Johns Hopkins University. Let's welcome Professors Pond, Carlson, and Wolman as they reminisce for us about their years here.
Before I start, I would like to thank Sherry for letting me appear. She never learns. This is the third time she's let me share this podium. But I was asked to reminisce a little about what Hopkins was like when I came here, and I decided that I would not talk about the people or the role models that I found here that I could follow, or the delightful curriculum that I found myself in. I thought I'd like to talk about something that was and will never be again like it was. And I want to talk about the physical plant. In order for you to appreciate where I'm coming from, let me say that I was born and raised on the fringe of the Dismal Swamp, and after that spent an enlistment in the pre-World War Navy, pre-Second World War Navy, which was a kind of brutal Navy, and then 4 years in a rather stark land-grant college, rather large campus that wasn't very well treed, or it was almost like a prison in some respects. Then I went to the steel mill, and I came from the bowels of the steel mill to Johns Hopkins. And having lived in the middle of Sparrows Point while I worked there, to come here on February the 1st, 1947 was absolutely a delight for me, just from the standpoint of the physical plant. And I want to tell you what it was like. To frame you in the time, in 1947, the linden trees were still growing down the center of Charles Street as well as on both sides. And it was still a time when we had an Easter parade on Charles Street. And my wife and I used to bring our infants over and roll them up and down in the middle of the Easter parade that was going on. It was also a time of the Thanksgiving parade, which you may or may not remember, but I remember that in sometimes not very nice terms, because the Christmas parade, all of the department stores had their floats, and lots of people that were uniformed and put on costumes, and they did all of this in the basement of Maryland Hall where I was housed, and they interfered with our labs quite a bit, but the floats were blown up on a parking lot that was adjacent and proceeded down Charles Street. It was also the time when what we call a birthday cake, or the Johns Hopkins bust that sits at the entrance on 33rd Street, sat in the middle of Charles Street, it on 34th Street, and it was a circle around it, and we call it the birthday cake. It was on a riser, so little steps going up to it. I even remember the afternoon when it was decided, it was demanded that that be moved, because someone turned in a false fire alarm, and 2 fire trucks came, one going north and one going south to come onto the campus, and they both went on the same side of the birthday cake. And if I remember correctly, about 7 firemen were fatally injured, and so we had to move that. But nevertheless, let's get to the campus and see what we really had, because I don't know whether you know it or not, but there are 33 buildings on this campus at the current moment, if you even counting the White House and the barn. And of those 33 buildings, only 16 of them were here when I came here, and so I watched 17 of them being built. I'd like to describe for you a little bit of what I saw when I came here. In the lower quadrangle, where engineering is situated now, the only thing that was there was Latrobe Hall and Maryland Hall and a power plant, and nothing else. And then if we went around to Levering Hall, we find out what you know as Levering Hall now was an entirely different place. Actually, Levering Hall was originally built in a T form. And just before I got here, they had added in one little hollow of that T, actually on the southwest side, it added 1 story, which was a cafeteria, and it was there when I came here. But it hadn't been filled in as a 2nd story. And actually, the building wasn't even owned by Hopkins. It was owned by the YMCA. Levering Hall was was a branch of the Metropolitan YMCA, and it was later years that Hopkins took it over. There was something here that isn't here today. Most everything else was built. These 17 buildings were built. But there was one building that was standing here that was a delight, and I wish it were still here. And over in front of where the hospital is, the public health hospital, in that playing field, just the other side of Garland Hall, was something called a Wyman House, I think. I was told that it was a classic example of Italian Renaissance architecture. And I don't know whether it was or it wasn't, but it was a delightful place, I can tell you. Had a raised seam roof on it, I remember, and it was painted orange and green. And I can also tell you that all the steelwork that were in the bars on the windows in the place were genuine wrought iron, because I did a lot of metallography on those for years. I stole all of those. When they tore the house down, Upper Quadrangle, Kaiser Quadrangle, we had Gilman Hall, Mergenthal, and Rowland. They were here, but Ames Hall was missing. And where Ames Hall now stands was a tennis court. And I tell you, every time I pass Atch Duncan on the street, I think of that tennis court, because he's, like many of us, has gotten to be older and we don't move quite as fast as we used to. But I remember standing on the balcony in Maryland Hall looking down that tennis court and saw the only time in my life I've ever seen a tennis player jump across the net. And I saw Atch Duncan do that after he'd won a game. Well, in any event, it was an absolutely delightful campus. You could walk anywhere you wanted and you felt like you were in heaven. You didn't even hear the street noises that were outside. And for someone who was born and raised in the swamps, this was like coming home for me. Actually, I used to take my lunch break by going to sit on the dam, which you can still find if you want to. It's on the west side of the Glass Pavilion. The drive-through now at the Glass Pavilion, if you don't drive through, if you get out and walk on the outside of that, there's a walkway, and you look down below, you find there's still the abutments, the limestone wall of an old holding pond that belonged to the Wyman estate, as I understand it. Well, before they built the Glass Pavilion, that was all there, and I used to go and eat my lunch, and because I lived a long way away, and I had to ride a streetcar in, I didn't have a car, and eating at the club was kind of expensive for me, I thought, because it cost 25 cents to eat lunch at the club in those days. Well, in any event, my wife would pack me a lunch, and I'd eat, and then I'd go down in the gorge, and you could walk all the way to Druid Hill Park. And my big game was to see if I could get over there and back before I had class. Well, it was a delightful place for me, and I'd like to tell you, however, how I was received when I came here. And I'd like to tell you why I came here. I think Spike and I talked one day with Abel, and I think we all came for perhaps a little bit different reasons. Some of us came as students, but actually I was at Bethlehem Steel, and I needed to go to graduate. I wanted to teach, and I needed to go to graduate school. And so I found out that they had an opening here in mechanical engineering. The veterans had started to come back, and the class loads were high, and they had a course here that was taught. I know because he told me by Dean Whitehead years and years ago. It was taught by Dean Cowenhoven. It was taught by Christie, who was chairman of the mechanical engineering department when I came here. I think everybody that was a professor here must have taught it sometime. But nevertheless, I was brought to assist in the teaching of that course with the stipulation that I would be allowed, I would be an instructor, and I would be paid, which was fortunate since I had a family, and I'd be allowed to go to class and win a degree. And Dean Cowenhoven says if you're real diligent, in 5 or 6 years you'll be able to get your PhD or your Doctor of Engineering. They didn't give PhDs in engineering in those days, but that was great. And so I came on February the 1st, and Dean Cowenhoven summons me to his office. I hadn't been here very long. He says, "Pon," said, "I got some good news for you." And I said, "What's that?" He says, "Larry Duran," that was the man that I was supposed to assist. He says, "Larry Duran resigned yesterday." He said, "So you have the class. It has 167 students in it, 2 sections, 10 laboratories. You're in charge." And that's the way my career at Hopkins started. And from that day until this, I haven't had time to do much other than teach. But don't misunderstand me. I'm not complaining. It's one of the most exciting experiences anybody could ever have. And wherever that old saw came from, that the teacher is taught by the students, my students really did educate me. And I found it a wonderful place. And the only thing I really regret is all that beautiful campus is gone.
I arrived at Hopkins as an undergraduate student in 1938. The campus is an aerial view taken in about, all right, I think can you see that? All right, this is the Art Museum here, and you can identify the buildings on the campus. In those days, Mergenthaler Hall wasn't here, Ames Hall wasn't here. There were Maryland Latrobe, Gilman, Rowland, and Remsen, the White House, the dormitories, the athletic field up above. But notice the parking lots. The parking committee had everything under control. They're almost completely empty. And this was not because of their foresight. This was because the administration wasn't paying the faculty members' salaries high enough so that they could buy automobiles to park on the campus. So that was what I first saw when I came here in September 1938. My parents drove me down from New York, and I loaded my foot locker and laundry cases in a room in Alumni Memorial Hall, and they took off for home because the 1938 hurricane was on the way. No sooner had they left when I began to feel terribly homesick. I met some other open scholarship students, which I had. We had then scholarships for $450 a year for 4 years. That covered your tuition. We paid $225 a semester for room and board. I soon met Duncan McCrae, now an eminent sociologist at the University of North Carolina, Earl Coddington, former professor of math at UCLA and chairman of the department there, and Walt Terpening, a war hero and a labor lawyer in Cleveland who died here a few years ago. I did what most freshmen do, got homesick, terribly homesick. But I soon learned that when I was down to my last pair of shorts, that if I packed them in the laundry case and sent them home to my mother, the laundry case would return with scrupulously clean and ironed clothes, and packed in between the clothes would be a tin with an apple pie or homemade fudge or peanut brittle and oranges and bananas, and then stuck in one of the shirts so the postal inspectors would never find it, my mother thought, was a letter. You weren't supposed to put letters in laundry cases. It was a letter which told me all about the news at home, reminded me I should be going to church every Sunday, which I never did, And with a final note, why don't you write? It's been 6 weeks since we've had a letter from you. Typical undergraduate behavior. Well, the easiest way for me to organize a talk about my undergraduate years is to show you my transcript, not because I'm proud of it, which I am, but because it does, I can't see this at all, but can you see this in chart? All right, well, let's talk about my freshman year. In my freshman year, we took, notice the grades are H or S. That was the last year of the honor, satisfactory, and HS or F, and failure grading system. You either got an honor grade, which meant you were about in the top 10%, or you failed, which meant you were in the top 5 or 10%, or you were satisfactory. It was a fine grading system. I got an H in the history of Occidental civilization. I think that's probably the first course listed up there. I can't see it, so I don't know. That course was one of a 2-year course on Western civilization, taught by Lane, Painter, Albright, and the second part was Goldman, Stull-Holt, Greenfield, and numerous other illustrious historians. A memorable lecture in the first year was given by Abel Wolman, who told us about the Roman aqueduct and the Roman baths. He had made a calculation of the per capita consumption rate of the decadent Romans. He also compared that with the per capita consumption rate of the residents of Hollywood, California, which was substantially higher than that of the Romans. And he allowed us to draw our own conclusions from that. One of my classmates, Toy Swerdloff, who later was a top lacrosse goalie and then an editor of the newsletter, finally liked what he heard and settled in Hollywood, California, where he's a successful screenwriter. In my freshman year, perhaps 2 of the most memorable courses were the math course, which Francis Dominic Murnahan, his son Frank Murnahan is now one of our trustees, taught, and that was where I really began to learn something about mathematics. The next striking course, which I will never forget, was Dave Harker's course in general chemistry. I won't go into the details, but Harker gave anyone who did properly in the course an H at the end of the first semester, and he took them to the faculty club for lunch. I didn't get an H at the end of the first semester. I got one at the end of the second semester, and he said, sorry, number 2 doesn't count. 22 years later, he came back to Hopkins to tell us about his structural studies on ribonuclease, and I took him to lunch at the faculty. At least I could show some class. I have to say that he didn't get the structure right because he had forgotten some of his freshman chemistry, which was very important to determine the stoichiometry of the substances that you're dealing with, and he was dealing with a protein which he labeled with a heavy metal, and he never worked out the stoichiometry correctly before he tried to do the structure. In my sophomore year, I had been a pre-med originally, but didn't like it so much. But by the time of my sophomore year, I was taking physics. I really was turned on by physics. And what other courses do I have listed there?
French.
Oh, French. Oh, French. Yes, French. 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 Fine, French. I had French in high school, and so we went to read French. But one of the things that I did, no sooner had I gotten to Hopkins, was with most other students, we visited the Gaiety on the block. The Gaiety was a burlesque theater. And we frequently saw our French professor in the front row of the Gaiety. And we made a point of being in the foyer when he came out of the show, so that he knew we had seen him. There were a lot of funny events like that, but by the time I'd gotten, oh, yes. In my freshman year, one of my lab, not the partners, but associates, was Jake Beezer, who, as most of you probably know, dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. Another of my lab associates was Zalman Shapiro, who several years later was, I think, at least alleged, possibly indicted, for smuggling uranium-235 to the Israelis. He was running a uranium reclamation plant in New Jersey. At that time, Fowler had an atom smasher smashing thorium in the courtyard of Remsen, and he was putting up thermal diffusion columns to purify uranium-235. Irene Davis, Mary First, Ruth First, Bernadette Judge, and all of their lovely aides were scared stiff of what was going on around them, and justifiably so. I think they later packed a lot of water around them because the registrar's office and the treasurer's office were on the first floor of Remsen. In my sophomore year, as I say, I switched to physics, and there again, courses went pretty well. I wasn't up to par in history course. But by my junior year, I was well into physics. I still was taking organic chemistry or something like that, which persuaded me that I absolutely made the best decision by going into physics. The course in mathematics in my junior year was taught by Oscar Zariski. Zariski was a renowned mathematician who died just a few years ago, and several years after I graduated, I saw him at Harvard. Duncan McCrae and I had gone to Harvard. And he recognized us. I was absolutely astonished that such a distinguished professor and a man who taught us the meaning of mathematical proof. I couldn't integrate anything, and I didn't flunk, but I had a hell of a time doing the homework problems. We were supposed to be being taught how to integrate. He didn't bother with that. He taught us mathematics, and it was an inspirational experience. You know, I forgot to turn my alarm clock on. It's just the time. At any rate, I'll turn it on now. It's all right. At any rate, my most significant course as an undergraduate here was German short stories taught by Robert Bruce Ralston. And you'll see up there that in the second semester, I got a D in that course. I am very proud of that D. Well, I learned something from it. I had bombed the exam, no question about it. I didn't think I had, but in Ralston's mind, I had. His course was simply sight reading. All you did was go in and read sight German. And at the end of the year, you gave a bunch of German pages that you'd never seen before, and you read them again. I saw him on the campus the night after the exam, and he said, "Young man, somebody should hang you up on a meat hook." I said, "What happened?" And he said, "Rabbits, rabbits. Where did you ever get rabbits? Come and see me in the morning." Well, after a sleepless night, I came to Dr. Ralston's office, and apparently I had translated the man's name, Harry, Harre, or whatever his name was, as hare. I thought it was rabbits. I had to run out and take my physical chemistry exam. We had double exams that day. So I didn't care. I went. And he handed me the blue book. We still had blue books then. There was a big F on it. And then he pointed to a pile of books on the table, and he said, "Mr. Carlson, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. You can take those books home for the summer and study them and come back and take a re-exam." And I said, "And what if I refuse?" And he stopped for a minute. And he said, "In that case, you take a D." I said, "Fine, I'll take the D." And I left. But the important thing about that was that all of a sudden, I realized while talking to Dr. Ralston that grades aren't the most important thing in life. And I think he realized it too. And that is why he said, "This is one of the students who is breaking everybody's neck trying to get grades. He deserves to pass the course. So I'll change the D to an F." I think that's an important point which undergraduates today have completely overlooked in their undergraduate education. Perhaps the faculty have too. At any rate, by my senior year, I was well involved in physics courses, but between my junior and senior years, I had several summer jobs. I worked on a road gang as a common laborer and hod carrier, as a water boy, and payroll clerk and timekeeper. That's where I learned how to keep double books, which I have found useful as a departmental chairman ever since. That summer between my junior and senior years, I spent part of the summer working in a very fashionable insane asylum in Westchester County, New York. And one of the patients was being treated with metrazole shock, convulsive shock therapy, with electric shock therapy, insulin shock therapy, and I, being an attendant, tried to hold this man down. The man was a refugee from Nazi Germany, and we were trying to help him regain his sanity. I don't think we did very much for the man, but it was clear by that time, by the summer of 41, that the war was in my own backyard. And when I returned as a first semester of my senior year, sitting up in the second floor dormitory room in the Alumni Memorial Hall, the one above the recreation room, I heard on December 7th, 1941, the radio interruption and a news report about Pearl Harbor. I woke up, Turpinning, my roommate, and he began studying trigonometry and analytical geometry more rigorously than I was teaching him that. He wanted to get in the Navy as a 90-day wonder, which he did, and later, with his footlocker full of scotch, he sailed from Norfolk to the Pacific and won, I think, a Navy Star or something like that for valor. I left. We were graduated in April 14th, about April then, in 1942. And Duncan McCrae and I took off for Harvard, where we spent the war doing war research. I always felt that peculiar mixture of being educated about the world and life at the same time that the world seemed to me, as it turned out subsequently, and still is, was falling apart. That I have, in some strange way, felt that this concatenation of events that I've described here as an undergraduate have given me an attitude about the world and life in general, and particularly the D in German, that have left me, and this I credit Hopkins for, have left me with a view that there are more important things in life than getting high grades in your courses.
God, am I pleased that these two adolescents prepared the groundwork for me. It's a remarkable event to hear them in their gentle, their exciting, their tributes to this great university. I am not bound. These young ladies who set this all up did put some limitations on our time allotment. I have an arrangement with them which they didn't know until just now, that I'll probably violate those arrangements. But the two adolescents have prepared me as to what I could comment on in one or two details, and then sail off on my own to that part of life before they were born. I think I'm reasonably accurate in the reality. If not, they can, on the parlance of the street, they can sue me. One of the things I do want to mention about the university, which I had not included in my very brief notes, I think, Bob, you did refer, Spike did, to the tuition at the time. And in my day, it was even less than the figure he gave, which, of course, in present day characteristics, I don't know what that would amount to, because I now treat in trillions of dollars. And he mentioned something down, way below, in the decimal point field. But my tuition time I was here, I think was a little bit less than $400. U.S. money, which then really was reasonably stable. And the reason I mention it, we had a remarkable registrar, and I didn't have any money to pay it. By that I mean I didn't have any family that had any money to pay. Parallels, I think, both of you. And the registrar said to me, Abel, don't worry about that very much. I did have some scholarships until there were no more to be had. And he said, you pay it when you get out, and you get a job, and in course of time, you pay it off. You know what that course of time was after I got a job? Because my first full-time job was $60 a month. At that time, a highly creditable occupation. The registrar said, pay it off when you can, at no interest. I had a family celebration when the last thing was paid off 10 years after my full-time job. And since we've indulged a little bit of personalities here and personal life, I had to defer my marriage to my late wife a good many years, simply because I had to wait until I had a sufficient salary to live for two people instead of one. And I then reached the magnificent return of $1,200 a year. And I said to my lady, who was very understanding, as those of you who knew her, that I have a birthday celebration. If you can marry me on that day, it's the only day I have off, we will get married. And if you don't do it that day, God knows when. And I'm very glad to report to you that she did. Now let me turn to, I have one other remark, also not in my time allotment. You heard from Bob Pond, and I want to congratulate him and have you join in with me that in September of 1988, he's getting one of the most important international awards for his deserved competence, and he didn't tell you very much about this during his speech, but join me in your congratulations. Now I want to come to time after adolescence. As I've indicated to you, these two gentlemen have given me a pitch which is very remarkable. The Committee on Arrangements, largely Sherry, said to me they'd like me to talk a bit about the background of my own career, with some wit and so on. And I thought when she said that, what's the order of the presentation today? And fortunately for me, I don't have to be witty, because these two young people provided that for me. And if I use it at all, it will be due to them. And that should go into the record, that I owe wit to Bob Pond and to our gentleman here. And you will get an A and not a D for that kind of thing. Now let me go back to 3 dates, and I won't burden you with any dates much beyond that. One date is 1909. I was charged by Sherry of being 96 years old. I was shortchanged. That doesn't happen until June.
Sorry about that.
And I wish you'd hold it off a little bit. I know you can't really do that, but you hold it up. But 1909 is the date. I graduated from City College in 1909. And I want to indicate to you that in 1913, I got my Bachelor of Arts at this university. And strangely, Spike, you reminded me of an interesting fact. You're looking at an individual who's designated internationally as an engineer. But I graduated with a Bachelor of Arts as a pre-med student. No engineering whatsoever. Don't tell anybody. Because I still travel the globe and I still work for people And for heaven's sakes, don't tell anything what's happening today. I went into graduate work, got my engineering all in graduate study, and very fortunately for me. And this I got in 1915. I want to talk about several things. All my undergraduate work was downtown Baltimore. I knew of this campus only by being able to come up here once in a while to see it, because I was born on the east side of Baltimore. I have a very great distinction. It was in a house tremendously great in size, 14 feet wide. You know, familiar red brick? Those marvelous white steps, washed every day, then, no longer, torn down after I did get my son Reds to travel down there and photograph that mansion in which there lived 6 people, 3, 4, or 5 refugees from Europe, staying over my dead body, it seemed, when I was growing up for years at a time until we could find a job for them. So we always had a minimum of 8 or 10 people, 2.5 stories high, total acreage of the house, equivalent to 2 rooms in what we now call modern housing for the poor. It's a remarkable picture, and the summary of that is we were all happy. It's possible to do so in a small house. I was once chairman of the Housing Standards for the United States. When I looked them over, I said, the entire acreage of the house in which I grew up happily is in 1.5 rooms in the new house. It's compulsory. So I depart from that and go back to where I was downtown for 4 years, getting my bachelor's degree. In all those old, decrepit houses, and again, with tremendous satisfaction to this particular student. And I'll tell you why. Number one, teachers. Teachers who gave me what spark I still have left, but throughout most of my life. I had the tops, as you might guess. Our total class, I think, was something in the neighborhood of less than 35. And I had them all. From the dean of philosophy. He'd come and talk to us at that time in the Bachelor of Arts and Sciences about the philosophy that Spike referred to in the world, which I shall never forget. Another thing I shall never forget, and I don't know whether it's a secret or not, when that gentleman, and he was a gentleman of the old school, tender, personal, loving, come in and talk to us about it for 40 minutes, but of great numerical, quantitative importance. He left the university something over $1 million. Not to this day, because I made it my business to find out where a dean of something at a university at that time, they probably got about $682.50 for his position. Where'd you get $1 million plus? His daughter married an important gentleman in the Dow Chemical Company. And that important gentleman advised the dean, where do you put your money in stock? I wish I had such a son-in-law. I got a good one, but anyhow, those were the buildings. And those were where I did a number of curious things, aside from the disciplines with which I was dealing. We had the teachers, and they were great individually, and we had the best of them. And we had remarkable guys who had excitement which sparked this particular student and a good many others. In what? You'd be interested. I had 4 years of German, Spike. I shouldn't say this to you in public. So forget it to you. I passed them all. I had 4 years of French. I had all your physics. I had all your mathematics. I had all your biology. I rap on wood. This is the way we should produce undergraduates. I came back to Hopkins at their request for so-called full-time teaching in 1939. I said I'd come under one condition. There were 2 or 3 others which I won't share with you. One was, I will not produce engineers on an undergraduate level, and I never have. The first institution in the United States with that procedure, and the only one yet. We have as Bob knows, we have an enormous number of graduate students. And we did it. And it shows that you can do it, and that the students would want to do it. So I come back to that. We had downtown relatively little equipment. Let me give you a picture of how one lived at the time. I lived on, a very remote distance from the university. I had to walk to it. And I had to walk to it. It took about 30 minutes each way, every day. If it rained, my mother would say to me, here's 5 cents for the trolley. But if the day is clear, there's no 5 cents for the trolley, you walk. Now I read parent-teacher meetings these days. When somebody suggested his children should walk 3.5 blocks to school, this is in Baltimore. There was a riot of the parents. And I listened to them, I said to myself, that's an interesting change in the dynamics of teaching and pupils. That's too far for us to walk. Now, of course, it's true. It's traffic. You might get run over, and frequently you do. And this, of course, is what I worry about. But I say I got there, and in between classes, I would sit in what was a kind of a leveling hall. I'd sit looking out the window there, as what one does, and looking out of a window where some people go by. Here you can't do it because you don't quite see what you see. There were young ladies walking by, I don't know why, during lunchtime. My lunch I bought across the street. That was another nickel. For that, I get a glass of milk this size here, and a bun, and very nourishing under these good days. And that was the kind of thing there was. I did another thing there, which I wanted to share with you. It's not in the record, and I'm giving you all this simply because I have confidence in the fact that you will never tell anybody else. God, I have that assurance. I played lacrosse. I was a lousy lacrosse player. But I'd go to that place down there where every day we played in that McCoy Hall, the so-called barn. And my purpose was to feed the ball to the first national champion crowd, which played there every day. To my joy, and I'm certain to their joy, because I'd feed it to this guy called Huck, who was about 120 pounds. No, 180 pounds. And he was great, as I happened to get to know him later. I share that with you because that is really in my honor and in my reminiscing with you. This last Saturday, I did 2 things. Last Saturday. One, and I will quote to you, this was in yesterday morning's paper in the comic strip, the one that is known as Mother Goose and Grimm. And you'll soon notice why I mention it to you. Dear Mr. Goose, or Mrs. Goose, what are your secrets of remaining young? Eat right, she said, sleep well, and never go to a class reunion. I can imagine that. I didn't have this before I went Saturday. And I want to share those two events, and then I will keep within your time sequence, hopefully overrunning it. Saturday afternoon, there were 200 university students at Hopkins from the whole country. They were the debating team representatives of the entire United States, and they were the winners who were here to settle on the final national awards. And in an unguarded moment the previous week, when the guy who was doing all this here, senior in physics here, wheedled me into accepting what he called the President of the House of Parliament, and you're looking at him. And that was my post. And I was to come there and do something unknown to me. But he then sent me, I said, put it down on paper so I can understand what it is. He sent me 2 pages as to what I was to do. And I was to preside and call on the first parliamentarian, the second one, and third one, and fourth one. And that was to last, he said, about an hour. That's important to remember. Important to me because I said, look, I have another obligation. A couple months ago, I agreed to come to the reunion of the class of 43. And I agreed to do it. It was the war crowd, 77 or 8 of them. And I'd agreed to do that. And then this guy came along and I said, look, I can't tell you yet until I find the chairman who's doing the other dinner. I found him. He's in Hagerstown, but he was in Baltimore, and my marvelous secretary found him, and he called me. I said, Mike, I have a problem. I'm due at 2 places at the same time. And since I do pretty well, I couldn't quite hurdle that. I said, what should I do? He said, you know, we will be drinking that water. He said, what about when did they say you could get there? I said, they said I would get there at 7:12. Finish at 7 o'clock. Oh, he said, my God, we've been drinking more longer than that. And I said, I accept the fact, so look for me. He said, you can start drinking as soon as you come. But lo and behold, so I told this fellow I would do it, and all prepared to do it. I said, now pick me up at 6:30. They're not in the buildings here, but in the church, block away. At 5 o'clock, he calls me and he says, we're having a little bit of trouble. He's trying to get these people organized. Having a little bit of trouble. May not be able to start at 5:30, he called me, at 6. Make matters short, I had an agreement with him that he couldn't possibly get me back to 43, the faculty club, by 7:15. I said, well, the way it is you're telling me, if I get back there by 10 o'clock tonight, it'll be too late for drinking. And this I cannot buy. So he said, well, it would be nice if you could talk to this crowd, and we'll interrupt you so you can. I said, yes, I'll do that. When do you want me? He said, we'll put you on at 7:15. So I said, all right, I'll come. Pick me up at 6:30, and I'll talk at 7:15. And then you deliver me to that faculty club. Car comes, 6:20, 6:29. Get in the car, there's a young gentleman, not the same one, and he starts driving. And as he starts driving around, I said, where are you going? You're not going to that church. I could walk over there. No. He said, I'm taking you to the faculty club. I said, I'm not doing the faculty club. I'm supposed to make a speech at your place. He said, You can't do that because it won't work. So here I am revealing this from the sublime to the ridiculous. Now, what do you want me to say there? I was on the Johns Hopkins University debating team. And I can see your pencils and paper working. In 1912, my brother Leo, who was getting his doctorate in economics, was on the second parallel Johns Hopkins University debating team. I went to the University of Virginia to debate against the University of Virginia. He debated here against the University of North Carolina, the two of them distinguished for lacrosse. Remember, this year. I lost the debate. I was positive that we were great and marvelous, but you know what it is with local paid judges. You have them everywhere. We have them now, every place. So I lost that one. My brother Leo won against North Carolina. I rehearse that with you because it's part of the kind of an existence we have developed ever since that time. These are the reminiscences. I agree with Spike. When I got here, there was nothing here, building-wise. There were trees. There were grass. I won't pursue that much further except to say, when they started to demolish Charles Street from 29th to University Parkway, due to that collapse of the engineers, of the firemen, they were running against each other, against the traffic. But when they started to suggest tearing off this piece of grass and that piece of grass, I appeared before the city council against Mr. Barnes, who was saying to them that if you give this extra lane of traffic, you would save 2.86 minutes going from downtown to home. I appeared before them to say, I don't have any such quantitative figures. I can't give a value to a tree, and I can't give a value to green grass. This message I leave with the JHU lovers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I want to thank all three of you for sharing your wonderful memories with us. And if any of you would like to greet these gentlemen, please feel free to come up. Thanks again.